My town is old. Its roots deep and tangled. Drinking something that has always been here. Almost everyone can trace their blood back to the first settlers, Finnish immigrants who laid the first bricks, built the first roads, carved the town from the earth. They came in boats, arrived in winters, walked the frozen forests, and built homes where the ground swallowed their footprints. On the surface, it's like any other small town. Quiet, insular, familiar. But there's a tradition here, something that doesn't belong to us. But we carry anyway. Something older than the town itself. Sulaaphoria. The church bells ring for it. The radio hums with it. The diner booths whisper it over black coffee. It used to happen rarely. Once. Twice a year. After a long dedication. Like a prize at the end of devotion. Now, it happens every day. Somewhere, someone is achieving. Somewhere, someone is gone. The first time I witnessed someone achieve Sulaaphoria was at the bar with Melody. Did you hear about Hansel? She asked, swirling her drink. He achieved last night. Just lay in the snow in Poov. Gone. Hansel had vanished 2 weeks ago. The night after that, Dave spent hours lowering himself into hotter and hotter water, grinning as steam curled from his skin. Melody and I were growing desperate. We had tried everything. Wax burns, sauna sits, fasting until our ribs counted for themselves. Nothing. We were still here. That night, the bar was packed. Wall to wall. No laughter. No breaking glass. The usual drunken shouting had been replaced by something quieter. Something electric. I tapped someone's shoulder. What's going on? Artur turned. Gaunt. Cheekbones carved sharp. His skin stretched thin from months of the water diet. He had the look of someone almost there. Someone waiting to be taken. They found a new way. He whispered. At the center of the room, 3 young men stood in black to gas, each holding a shot glass. The crowd held its breath. In perfect unison, they drank. A single second stretched. Unbearably long. The air shimmered. Then their bodies softened, blurred at the edges, like a heat mirage. The folds of their skin began to separate, like liquid pulling apart. The moment hung, viscous, heavy. They dissolved. Their clothes collapsed onto the floor, still damp with sweat and spilled liquor. Sulaaphoria. The crowd erupted. Cheers. Shouts. People slamming their glasses down on the bar, ordering rounds of tequila. I'll have what they had. That's all it took. Melody nudged a crumpled toga with the toe of her shoe. How long have we been trying? All they did was what? Just some fucking shots? People were vanishing everywhere now. The diner had lost their entire staff overnight. Kids wandered the streets. Their parents gone mid-breakfast. Their plates still warm. It wasn't that it was strange. Just disappointing that it hadn't happened for me. I ordered a shot of tequila, same as the 3 from before. I closed my eyes as I tipped it back. Swallowed. Waited. Nothing. The bar was suffocating. My vision doubled. Was this it? Was this the moment before? Maybe I wanted it too much. Through the blur, I saw Melody across the room, swaying, eyes fluttering, deep in conversation with a group of strangers. I pushed through the crowd. Their words tangled together, melting. Dispersion, flux, all spoken with an evangelical urge. It wraps around you, pulls you through. Then bam, gone. A man turned toward me, his expression shifting. What? Have you seen? The world tilted. Something clenched in my stomach. My breath felt too slow. A light smeared across my vision. I muttered something, maybe something blasphemous. It was one thing to speak of how someone achieved. It was another thing entirely to claim to know what happened after. Only the ones who see had that right. His expression darkened. Before I could react, his fist caught me across the jaw. I hit the floor, too dizzy to get up. The crowd laughed. Melody shouting for them to stop. But I hardly noticed. The floor was sticky with sugar and evaporated beer. It was warm, hopeful. My limbs numbed. The bodies above me blurred, undulating like wax, shifting, changing, melting into each other. Then I saw him, the man who hit me. His skin creased, pulled open, unzipped. Droplets of him lifted into the air, tiny globes of light reflecting the faces of the crowd. Each drop held something, a memory, a moment, dissolving, fading away. His body remained for a second longer. Hollow. Something moved inside. A thread-thin worm, white and delicate, crept forward. It lingered, drinking up the droplets, pulling them into itself. It did not look hurried, worthful. By the time I blinked, there was nothing left but clothes. The music swelled back into focus. The crowd cheered, bodies pressing against each other, breath warm, damp, drunk with it all. I turned to Melody, my breath unsteady. What was that? Did you see that? She scoffed, kicking at the empty clothes on the floor. Yeah, a bunch of bullshit is what that was. I didn't remember getting home. I woke up to a hangover and a phone call. Melody's mother. She was crying, but it wasn't grief. She was so sick after the bar. She said, I told her, that's what happens. But then, the vomiting stopped and Sulaaphoria. A breath, shuddering, reverence. It was beautiful. Jessica, I wish you could have been there. Melody was gone. Just like that. I pressed my hand to my stomach, waiting for something to twist, to ache, but I only felt empty. As it says in the methods of Sulaaphoria, the dispersed live on your breath. So I exhaled. I collapsed back into bed. Tried to sleep the rest of it off. I kept the radio on while I worked the next day. 93.7 FM The Melts. The host's voice was warm, unhurried. A record number of achievements this season. We'll be taking calls after the break. Who do you think will be next? Could be you. Could be me. Could be your next door neighbor. Ain't it a beautiful thing? Outside, people sipped coffee at the CAF, gossiping about who might be next. The diner across the street was short-staffed again, more empty aprons left in the back. More half-eaten meals cooling on abandoned plates. No one seemed alarmed. I kept shelving books, trying to focus, but my fingers caught on something strange. A book I didn't recognize. It wasn't in the system. No barcode. A pamphlet slipped free. Its cover was cracked, gold lettering peeling at the edges. But I knew the word. Sulaaphoria. Beneath it, a subtitle, The Tracts of the Seers. Inside, the handwriting was uneven, jagged, smudged where the ink had been pressed hard. A passage caught my eye. Abe the first went away with the snout, and Claire followed in the water. We all knew that phrase. One of the first things we were taught. A simple way to remember the methods. But beneath it, in handwriting that did not belong to the original text. Who saw them go? A seer. A weight settled in my chest. Someone had left this here. Someone wanted me to read it. At the back of the pamphlet, a note. Come before sundown. An address. I shut the book, tucked the pamphlet inside. I could pretend I never saw it. I could throw it away. Instead, I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the cold. The windshield was frozen over, a thin pane of ice sealing me in. A perfect sheet of white, like the world outside had been scrubbed away. I turned on the defrost, but the cold clung stubbornly to the glass. I reached into the back seat, fingers stiff as I fumbled for the scraper. My knuckles ached, the dry air pulling at my skin. The moment I touched the handle, something shifted. A whisper, soft at first, curling at the edges of my ears, barely louder than my own breath. It was easy to ignore, like the sound of the house settling at night, the distant hum of a street lamp, something just on the verge of being real. The ice on the windshield cracks. Hairline fracture webbed outward, slow and deliberate. The whisper wasn't alone. More voices joined, layering, shifting, a chorus pressing against my ears. Some were too distant to hear. Some felt too close. My breath came shallow, my pulse knocking against my ribs. The voices tangled, rose, folded over each other. The more I tried to make sense of them, the worse it became. My name, not spoken but exhaled. Melody? I whispered. The windshield groaned. The fractures deepened, spidering outward, the ice straining against itself, warping under a pressure I couldn't see. It wasn't the defrost. It wasn't the heat. It was something else. A quote from the methods of Sulaaphoria came to me. They live at the moment of liminal matter. I gripped the scraper tighter, but my hands were useless. The voices wove through the air, a low hum beneath my skin, a vibration in my bones. The glass shuddered. I was sitting in my car, the heater blasting, and I had never felt colder. A voice, breathless and hollow, like wind through bone. Jessica. I threw the door open, stumbled onto the pavement, the cold biting into my skin. My breath came hard and fast, vapor plummeting into the air. The world had emptied. No winds, no whispers, just the weight of the quiet pressing down on me, thick as snowmolts. I stood still, waiting. My ears rang with the absence of sound. My fingers flexed around the scraper. The windshield was still frozen, the fractures holding steady. The ice had just begun to melt. I forced myself to move, scraping away at the frost, my hands trembling. I should have gone to the address. I didn't. Instead, I went home. The house swallowed me whole. The door shut behind me. The air thick, humid, stale. I stood in the dark, waiting for my body to feel like it belonged to me again. I called for my dog. Arcades? No paws against the wood. No skittering claws. Come here, bud. Silence. The kind that settles over a graveyard. I stepped into the kitchen. The faucet dripped, the sound loud in the stillness. The water in his bowl rippled. His collar rested beside it, the red nylon damp, coiled into itself like shed skin. His tag gleamed under the kitchen light, unreadable, as if the letters had been smudged out. I knelt, reaching for the collar. It was still warm. I pressed my fingers to the floor where he should have been. No fur, no sign that he had ever existed except for the space he left behind. This isn't happening. I thought, animals don't achieve. Do they? I thought about calling someone. Anyone. But who would I call? Melody would know what to do. But Melody was gone. My father was gone to the mist off a boat and my mother in the steam of a shower. Something moved in my peripheral vision. I turned. The water in Arcade's bowl trembled, a single ripple breaking across the surface. I bolted to the bathroom. The mirror was fogged over. My reflection barely visible. Warped, stretched. I peeled off my jacket, turned the shower knob, and let the steam rise like breath from a chasm. He trapped around me, thick and cloying, dampening my skin before the water even touched me. I stepped inside. The hot water pounded against my skull. My muscles loosened. My thoughts dissolved. I closed my eyes and let myself drift. Jessica. My eyes snapped open. Water streamed down the walls, gathering in slow, crawling rivulets. The steam thickened. Something moved in it. Not a shape or a person, just a sense of something. Jessica. I turned to fast, feet slipping against the wet tile. Caught myself on the wall. My fingers dragged through the condensation, leaving frantic, smeared lines. The whisper came again. Closer. Jessica. The steam curled around me, pressing into my skin. Heavy. Clinging. A dozen voices. 100. 1,000. And they all spoke at once. Seer. The air snapped. The voices vanished. The steam exhaled. I stumbled back. Hit the shower knob. I clutched the sink, staring at my reflection through the thinning fog. My face looked wrong. Hollow. The whispers were gone. But they weren't really. They had always been there hiding in the liminal matter. I understood. I turned off the water, pulled on my clothes with shaking hands. I didn't want to be in the house anymore. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I grabbed the tract of the Seers and my car keys. The note had said, "Come before sundown." I was going, because what else was there to do? I arrived at the address. The ground ruptured in slow. Bleeding mouths odd sprouts, splitting the frost-thin skin of the earth. They must be hardy, I thought, to push through the cold like that. The snow was streaked ox-blown, capillaries branching through white before seeping into a drainage ditch. The house loomed ahead, unfamiliar despite its nearness to the bookstore. I had never noticed it before. Could I have? Had it been here? The steps bowed under my weight, sponge-white rot tenderizing my feet before swallowing me whole. I knocked. The door thermed under my knuckles, its knots flexing like muscle. Beneath me, the earth exhaled, a tremor rippling through the soil like a dog shaking off fleas. A woman opened the door. She was thin as a shade, a wisp, her presence held only by the tension of the doorway, the weight of her own gaze. With a cold flick of her wrist, she beckoned me inside. I stepped over the threshold. Smoke lilted in the air and scents. Copo. I wasn't sure whether to cover my nose or my ears as the voices crackled through it, weaving into the air like threads through old fabric. You can hear it. Then? The woman asked. I hesitated. There's no use hiding from it. It seeps into your pores. Maybe if you burned them all off, that would stop it. Maybe then you'd achieve. She shrugged. Call me Ilseth. Sure, I muttered, struggling to focus. The walls seemed to press closer. Inhaling, exhaling. What is happening? She studied me, her expression unreadable. To you? Or to the town? Either way, questions aren't really part of your role. She rifled through a drawer, pulled out a cone of incense, struck a match. The sound rang out sharp as a gunshot. Please don't light that. She blew the match out instead. The silence filled with something heavier. I felt faint. You'll grow used to it, the voices. Strange to call someone a seer. Really, you don't just see. You hear. The achieved are so nigh for OUS. You know, can they hear me? She glanced at the ground, as if listening for something. I don't think so. But they are aware. It's like a flood of thoughts after the dam has burst. They rush through the pocked earth, filling holes, dispersing into the water, into the air. I swallowed hard, then asked the question that required no courage. Only inevitability. What is Sulaaphoria? Ilseth laughed. A short, breathless thing. For the first time, her placid expression cracked. I don't know. She admitted. The best I have is this: people are made of water, right? And it involves water, or vapor. We were in the dark, drowning in metaphors, circling endlessly, unable to touch the center. Words could only scrape at the edges, could only mimic meaning. Ilseth watched something settle over me. A recognition. Let's go into town, she said. I want to see with you. She turned toward the door. We'll meet with Father Grasshand. The town had unraveled, as if my absence, which lasted only the setting of the sun, had been mistaken for years. A sense of expiration. Waterlogged houses sagging under their own weight. Bloated bodies of buildings slouched into themselves. Mildewed cars sinking into rot. The town felt thin, stretched at the edges of itself, on the verge of sloughing away like dead skin. I opened my mouth to ask again what was happening. Ilseth, already knowing, said, You're seeing now. The town has always been a veneer. Life and living are veneer. I couldn't understand her. What is being covered? What did you see that night at the bar? My stomach twisted. How did you know I was there? It is my post to witness all occurrences of Sulaaphoria, Ilseth said, and to monitor the Sulaaphoria NTS, a word I had never heard before. It whisked about my mind, frictionless, but my thoughts dissolved as we reached the monastery. The gate loomed before us, a wrought iron mouth waiting to be fed. Ilseth took my hand. Her skin was damp. The worm gets thinner the more it eats. She turned my palm over, studied it, as if assessing its worth, as if appreciating for the last time what would soon be gone. I don't know if there is just one of them, or if there is one in everyone. She let my hand go. With resignation, she said, This phenomenon is not miraculous. Father Grashand's monastery stood in stark defiance of the town. It was extravagant. Ancient, its presence made the rest of the world feel flimsy, as though the town had been built from paper and regret. At times, memory softens the past, makes it golden, makes the present seem duller by comparison. This was the opposite. The monastery was raw, unvarnished, more than I had expected, as something found with age. It rested on a web of aqueducts, their veins pulsing with a copper-tinged flow. The tributaries fed into the monastery's foundation, threading through its bowels. Some glistened, slick and damp. Others had dried into brittle husks, rusted with time. As we crossed the yard, the earth thickened. It frothed, boiled over with voices. I faltered. Ilseth steadied me, her grip cold. She guided me not toward the door, but toward a rung of the aqueduct where a thin red stream ran, smooth as oil. Metallic mist filled my nose and mouth, so palpable I thought I could spit blood. My skin buzzed and itched. I could hear them, every voice. Take one, Ilseth said. The stream churned. 1,000 whispers tangled together. If I focused, if I picked apart the current, I could separate them. like fish in a stream. A pull gentle at first, then stronger, like something unraveling inside me. A thread yanked from my ribs, tightening against my spine. The hum of voices sharpened. One surfaced, a steady, endless murmur. Montgomery. Juneau. Phoenix. Montgomery. Juneau. Phoenix. Mr. Klein. My third-grade teacher. I remembered the day he achieved. It hadn't been planned. The whole class had drawn pictures of him and taped them to the walls in unspoken, spontaneous acts, as if we had all known, somehow, that it was time. When he saw them, he cried, and as he cried, he dissipated. We played in the classroom for hours before anyone thought to tell the principal. I let go of his voice, let it slip back into the current. The pull inside me loosened, leaving behind something hollow, an ache deep in my chest. Another voice. And, tuneless, ceaseless, like a song in the shower. And another, a wretched, broken sound, gagging, wet, relentless, gasping between her etches, porcelain splattered with bile, the sound of someone choking on themselves. Over and over, I recoiled. The sensation in my chest twisted. I tried to ignore it, to let it pass. It was just another voice, just another one of them. The sound followed me, tangled in my ribs, stuck in my throat. I tried to push it away, to let it dissolve into the currents. It refused. Somewhere, I had heard it before. Much later till late I would realize. Melody. The table gleamed under the candlelight, its gold red velvet heavy with dust and age, their contents unknown. A bowl of vain OUS bulbs pulsed faintly, nestled among thin, metal-nosed pipettes. Father Grass Hen sat at the head, framed by shadows. His chair ran for the room, as if he had been placed there by something older than the town itself. While Seth and I sat opposite each other, waiting. His mantle was clay-hued, heavy with black tendrils threading up his chest like a second circulatory system. Something about him made my skin tighten, an unspoken expectation pressing against my ribs. An urge to reach out, to touch his hands, to be granted absolution for a sin I had not named. Had they spoken of me before? Had old Seth told him what he had seen? Father Grass Hen did not blink, only shifted his gaze toward me and raised his hand slightly, as though granting permission to speak. You wish to know if and why you can see the worm, he said. A tome lay before him, thick and decayed, its cover worn into facelessness. He found his page by way of a colorless leather strip, the pages crackling like dry leaves under his fingers. When did you last enter this monastery? I haven't, I said. A slow smile spread across his lips, something thin and unreadable. Yes, I suppose you wouldn't recall. Not everyone has the privilege. He reached into the folds of his robe, appeared to withdraw nothing, then held out his hand, palm upturned. Mimic my gesture, he said. I hesitated. Still, I obeyed. I placed my hand on his. The moment our skin met, he moved. Fingers slid down, closed around my wrist. A sudden, crushing grip. His knuckles cracked. Blood surged to my fingertips. I flinched, tried to pull away, but his other hand was already rising from beneath the table. A scalpel. I jerked, body twisting. But Seth's hands were on me now, thin fingers pinning my free arm. The blade met my palm. Pain whitewashed my vision. I might have screamed, I couldn't tell. My body locked down. Blood ran down my wrist, seeping into the tablecloth, dark as spoiled fruit. With a pair of forceps, he reached into the wound. He pulled. 3 black seeds. He held them between his fingers, turned them in the candlelight, and set them before me. Your answer, he said. They washed and bound my wound. I felt like a captive, bound not by chains but by inevitability. There was nowhere to run. The seeds had been in me for years, an inheritance, a gift, a burden, a baptism meant to nullify the potential of Sulaaphoria, to still the water inside me before it could ripple. It was in my blood, the reason I would never achieve. Was Sulaaphoria punishment? A sin? Judged by who? My parents had spared me from it. Somehow. A mercy. Or a theft. There are things to show you, Father Grass Hen said. Pay attention to the walls. To the paintings. Seth. Tell her of them as we walk." He moved forward. I followed. Elseth trailed behind me. We left the hall where we'd sat, stepping into a corridor that pulled deeper into the monastery's belly. The air changed. It felt closer, denser, like water gathering in my lungs. Dread settled over me like a second skin. I knew then I would not leave the monastery alive. Elseth's hand dipped into her pocket, fingers curling around something hidden. A small thing. A final thing. She would use it. I was sure. Should I resist? We stepped forward. The floor was covered by a long red tongue of a carpet, swallowed by the dark at the corridor's end. Elseth spoke low. Her voice weighted, her gaze downcast. "The wall to the right holds the witnesses. Every one of them. Back to the town's beginning. The left is the holy see of Sulaaphoria. Every leader." A pause. "Father Grasshen is next in line for Sulaaph." The words were strange to me. I had never known Sulaaphoria to have a structure. Not like this. Not in sermons. Not in school. It had never been formal. It had only been presence, woven into breath and water. We reached the end of the hall. A door, old and sagging, waited for us. Father Grasshen gestured to the final 2 canvases before it. "Here," he said, pointing, "is Elseth, a portrait. Her face rendered in thin, dry strokes, as dark as wounds. And here," he said, turning to the blank canvas beside it, "will be yours, Jessica." The door groaned open. Aside was an altar, a single pew. Behind the altar, a mosaic. Green shoots burst from the earth. Blood rolled down a hill in slow, heavy drops. At its base, sallow genuflecto or knelt, mouths open, tongues stretched to catch the crimson flow. Behind them, golden aura-ed figures loomed, their lips wet, their bodies vaporous steam rising from the surface of a lake. And in the sun's place, a writhing mass, pale, faceless, squirming toward the ground in chimeric rays. Father Grasshen gestured to the pew. I sat, I stared. I wanted to feel something: faith, reverence, joy for Sulaaphoria. But I only felt awe and nausea. Elseth and Father Grasshen bowed their heads, whispering to each other, their voices low, indistinct. Elseth reached into her pocket. She pulled out a Venus bulb, its skin thick, gelatinous, the texture of waterlogged flesh. Beside it, she placed a pipette. She knelt. Father Grasshen stepped behind the altar, standing over the bulb. Over her, he raised the pipette in one hand, the bulb in the other. The pipette pierced the flesh of the bulb, sliding in like a feeding mosquito. A squeeze, a globule of crimson siphon into the vacuole. With this imbibement, a seer will be seen, and a witness born. He pressed the liquid past till Elseth's lips. Her body went glassy, shimmering like oil on water. Then she melted uprising into the air, partitioning, dispersing, becoming mist. A rent opened within her chest, the flesh yawning, pulling apart. A thin strand of worm listed between the orbs of her unraveling body, drinking down every drop of her existence. In flashes, the mist revealed her, fragments of memory, slipping free like spent film. Elseth, kneeling near a lake, watching as her parents waded in, were swallowed, gone. Elseth, alone in her home, 10 years old, lying in a puddle of spilled water, crying, waiting to be taken away. The worm turned, a weightless, thoughtless presence, shifting toward me. I lurched back, my breath trapped between a scream and silence. A useless reaction. It had already found the wound on my palm, and slid inside. I surfaced from unconsciousness in a blind panic, my limbs lashing out, my breath sharp as a blade. My scream ricocheted off the monastery walls, swallowed by the cavernous silence that followed. But it was not Father Grasshen who had woken me. A small group stood at a cautious distance. A fragile old woman, a man close to my age, and a little girl who pressed herself behind the others, her small hands clutching at fabric, knuckles white. The man spoke first. "I'm Xavier." His voice was flat, distant. "We found you here and there's no one else left." The girl peered at me, her eyes glassy, uncertain. I swallowed hard. My throat raw. Where's father? Xavier hesitated. Gone, I assume. Same as the others. His gaze drifted toward the floor. Scattered piles of clothes. That's all that's left. Dear, the old woman said softly, her voice lined with something knowing. It's only us now. It pains me to say, but we need to leave this place. I pushed myself upright. My body ached, but it was the hollowness in my chest that made me uneasy. I checked my hand. The gauze wrapped around it was stiff with blood. I unraveled it, let it drop to the floor. The wound beneath looked ordinary, no different from any other cut. My body felt whole, and yet something had changed. The air was too quiet. The altar stood undisturbed, save for a silk pouch and the battered book Father Grass Hen had thumbed through. Can we go? The girl whispered. I don't like it here. Xavier stepped forward, his tone edged with urgency. Hey, I don't know what happened to you, but everything's falling apart. Everyone is gone. The town is, except for us. The old woman interjected. She glanced at the girl, her smile thin. I'm too bitter, perhaps, and you're too sweet. The girl's expression faltered. Then how come mommy and daddy? I couldn't bear it. I'm not leaving. I snapped. Not until I figure out what the fuck is happening. My pulse roared in my ears. Something crawled inside me. The old woman pressed her hands over the girl's ears. I grabbed the book and the pouch from the altar. They told me I was a seer, a witness, but I don't even know what that means. I loosened the pouch's drawstring. Inside, the seeds. Small, black, inert. My fingers moved without thought, sifting through them, rolling their edges against my skin, pressing one between my fingertips. Harder, until I felt the bite of a pinprick. A bead of blood welling up. A sound bloomed. Not sound voices. The dispersing. The Sony for OUS. Every achieved voice. Slipping through the air. Filling me. Drowning me. I dropped the seeds. The whispering ceased. Maggie took a step forward. Sweetie. Call me Magdalene. Or Maggie. Was that a seed you were holding? I hesitated. I wanted to hoard them. To keep them from her. The instinct was sudden. Foreign. Get away from me, I said, recoiling. Maggie laughed. Unbothered. Xavier stepped forward. His hands raised. His posture careful calm me down or block me. I wasn't sure. You should treat me better. Dear, Maggie said, voice light. I could be useful to you. If nothing else. I've been around longer than most. Have you noticed that? I watched her. She wore a straw hat and a faded floral shirt, as though she had just left her garden and wandered here by accident. Then what are they? I asked. Scrying seeds. Of course. She pointed toward the pods on the altar. When I was your age, we used them to ask questions. Split one open. Count the seeds inside. The number was an answer. I frowned. Did you ever drink the liquid? We knew better than that. And her face paled as the sound came. It started as a low vibration, a pressure against my skull, like fingertips pressing into the soft place between bone and thought. A murmur just beyond hearing, too deep to be a voice, too rhythmic to be the wind. It thickened, deepened, layered itself in folds, dragging across the air like wet fabric run dry. Beneath it, a churning, a slow, nauseating movement of something vast and unseen, dragging its mass through the world. Then came the buzzing. Not like bees, like the spaces between bees, the absence where their bodies should be, the flickering nothingness between their wings, as if the air itself had begun to fray. A friction, a shimmer, 8,000 invisible threads snapping, vibrating, twisting themselves into knots. The sound carried weight, pressed against my teeth, slotted into my jawbone. The floor trembled in response. Xavier stiffened. His fingers clenched around the ragged scrap of cloth he held, knuckles white. Grandma, I think they're here. Maggie exhaled, slow, as though she had expected this, as though she had waited for it. They'll come soon. We need to go. The monastery walls seemed thinner now, stretched to a translucent, as if the stone had been scraped down to its last layer. A crack, distant but inevitable, needled through the silence. A sound slithered toward us, rising in pitch, as though a seam were coming and done. A tearing, a splitting, an unsipping of the air itself. I glanced toward the door. The shadows beyond it had begun to curdle, shifting not with movement but with breath, expanding, contracting, the shape of lungs filled with wet decay. Maggie turned to Xavier, nudging the girl toward him. "Take your sister into the tunnels. We'll follow." Then, to me, she said, "Jessica, it's clear your parents scared for you enough to exonerate you from the hell of Sulaaphoria. Do not spit on their graves. Those seeds went into your palm to save you. That is how I saved my grandchildren." Her face went grave. "But now you are vulnerable again. You hear it though, don't you? Sulaaphoria is coming. Behind us." The air thickened to a pulpy mass, damp heat curling along the edges of my skin. The monastery swayed not physically, not in any way I could see, but in a way I could feel, as though the entire structure had become a slow-breathing thing, inhaling me into its chest. My skin felt moist. Maggie studied me, then nodded toward the book and pouch in my hands. "Bring them. I have answers for you. Some. Quickly now." The sound inched closer, the air growing viscous, filling my throat, clogging the space between each heartbeat. I followed her. I don't know if I had a choice. The monastery groaned around us. Mist thickened around its frame, settling in its joints, unspooling from its seams. The structure still stood, but wrong, blurred, its foundation slack. Its dissolution seemed inevitable, as though the monastery had always been waiting to unmake itself. Ahead, the tunnel gaped open, black and waiting. Cold air poured from its mouth, heavy with the smell of old water and the leavings of things that had long since rotted away. It did not feel like a passage. It felt like an esophagus, slick-walled, pulsing, waiting to constrict. Maggie stepped inside without hesitation. I lingered. If I went down, I would leave the town behind. Not just physically, not just in distance. I would cross a threshold that could not be undone. The people I had known, the rituals I had been raised on, the way we spoke of life and death gone. I thought of Arcade's empty collar, of my father, dissolving into the mist off a boat, my mother, wicking into the heat of a shower, a melody's voice a splatter against porcelain. The earth quivered beneath my feet. Not just the earth, the air, the space itself. A tension, stretching thin. The sound behind us moved closer. Many noises, layered atop one another, folding and unfolding like water heaving against itself. A tide with no shore. It had no beginning, no source, no single mouth from which it was uttered. It sloshed in thick reverberations, nestling into the nodules of my spine like fingers slipping into wet clay. Maggie didn't look back. I clenched my fist, the pouch of seeds pressing into my palm. For the first time, I felt relief, or something shaped like it. I stepped forward, and the dart took me whole. The tunnel pressed in around us. The walls were damp and pulsed faintly, threaded with veins of exposed root and rock. The earth thickened as we descended, each breath clogging my throat, each footstep muffled by the dense, packed soil. The deeper we went, the heavier the dart became. We walked without speaking. The air behind us still shifted, still whispered, not the groaning of wood or the settling of stone, but a sound that suggested movement, not ours. It curled down into the tunnel after us, hesitant at first, then more sure, a slow, deliberate presence. For the first time, I was leaving the town. I would not say I was unhappy there, but I would not say I had ever been particularly happy. Either. The days passed in sameness, in rituals that felt inevitable, in quiet expectations of something that had not yet come for me. But here, with these people, in this place, I felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not even relief. Hope. Hope that the dream of my home would end, that whatever weight had held me there, bound me to its rituals, would dissolve as completely as they achieved. Now, it was just us, this small enclave. We would escape not just from the sound above, the droning thing that sent the earth trembling like a cold, wet dog, but from the whole dream of Sulaaphoria itself. Sulaaphoria means dissolving, means melting, means dispersing into the whole. It is the end of selfhood, not collectivism, not individuality, just nothing. And I was still here. A tunnel stretched endlessly, devouring our footsteps, Our breath. Our hunger. Maggie's flashlight wavered ahead of us, its dim glow swallowed by the yawning black. Every sound we made, each breath, each muttered whisper, each scrape of a boot against soil expanded outward, twisted back at us in guttural echoes, too warped to be our own. Alara whimpered, clinging to Maggie's arm. I'm hungry. She wasn't the only one. My own stomach nodded. My limbs felt slow, as though thickened with lead. I thought of the seeds in my pouch. Just 3. Too few to sustain. Too much risk. They would bring only pain. I thought. A tremor shuddered through the tunnel. Faint, at first. Then, a sound. Not above anymore. It was on the walls, pressing through the packed earth, threading itself into the roots and veins of the tunnel. A churning. A slow, wet unraveling. The burrowing weight of something vast shifting behind the thin skin of the earth. It did not rush. It did not need to. It was moving closer. I swallowed. Why didn't you bring food? I asked Maggie, my voice rough. She turned back, momentarily sweeping the flashlight away from the sloping tunnel ahead. For an instant, we walked blind. A wall of blackness enveloped us. Then, the light returned. It wasn't my expectation to leave this way, she said. Her voice was thinner than before, frayed at the edges. This town is complete. I forgot how quickly it happens upon completion. I don't want to hear that, Alara muttered, pressing her face against Maggie's side. I tightened my grip on the book. What does that mean? Maggie didn't answer right away. Her pace had slowed, her breathing uneven. I had forgotten how easily the elderly wore down. There had been so few of them in town by design. I suspected. She wiped sweat from her brow. Once we're out, you can read about it in that nice new book of yours. Her breath came to quick, to shallow. The sound behind us had grown stronger. I had the sense that if I turned around, I would not see anything. Not a thing to run from. Not a thing to fight. Only the suggestion of presence. The soft shimmer of space thinning at the edges. The moment before a structure folds inward. We are near the seed bank, Xavier said. He studied a ratty scrap of cloth, its surface webbed with inked lines. A map. His fingers twitched at the edges, holding it tightly. From there, we're almost out. Something shifted behind us. A pressure, a weight against the air. No chase, no urgency. Only the certainty that it was coming, and that it would not stop.